We welcome you to our Bible class tonight. Thank you for coming to be with us, and it's good to have you. We're going to continue our study tonight in one of the darkest chapters, probably the darkest hour of the New Testament, when we study in John chapter 19 this evening. John chapter 19. We've been watching Pilate proclaiming Jesus innocent and trying to let Jesus go. He was even, and you got to remember, let's say at the very top, that Pilate, as a Roman governor, was really indifferent to the health and welfare of the Jewish people as long as they stayed quiet, didn't cause any trouble, and paid their taxes. Otherwise, he cared nothing, one way or the other, about them. And so, whether Jesus lived or died was not that big a thing to Pilate. He crucified a lot of them, and he would crucify a lot more. And so this was not, we think about it as the crucifixion. It was not to Pilate. It was a crucifixion, another crucifixion. And what he was wanting to do in letting Jesus go was not so much about his conviction that he stated over and over and over again about I find no fault in this guy, as it was to keep the Jews from pushing him around. The Jewish spiritual leader, they didn't have any civil authority. They had spiritual authority over the Jews. The Romans conceded that to them. That would evolve later in the first century into every citizen is going to come with a pinch of incense and say, Caesar is Lord. But that's not this time yet. They were still free to practice their own little religion. They wanted to just keep quiet. Don't cause me any trouble. They were peacekeepers with a blunt force in the world that they dominated, in the Roman Empire. And so Jesus, being an innocent person, was not exactly what Pilate was scared about when we came to verse 8 last time, when as they had talked about the charge that the Jews were making against him, that he called himself the Son of God. And when Pilate heard that statement, he was even more afraid. And remember, we talked last time about what was Pilate afraid of? Well, maybe he was afraid of the idea of what's going to come up in a few minutes, about Caesar hearing that he had pardoned someone who was talking about being a king. Maybe he was afraid of a riot breaking out because these Jews were hot and they were getting out of hand. Right there at the judgment seat at daylight, they were already stirred up. They'd been up all night and they got him up early. But maybe he was afraid as a pagan, not a believer in capital G God, but as a pagan who believed, if he had believed anything, in a pantheon of gods, a bunch of gods. What if this fellow that he had already beaten so severely, what if he really was a son of a god? Remember, this is Pilate's thinking. We believe that Jesus is the Son of the true and living God. That was not his frame of reference at all. The Jews sure didn't believe that. That's why they wanted him dead. They thought he was a blasphemer. And so here in John 19:8, we talked about how that Pilate had heard the statement. And it made him even more afraid. What if he had offended one of his gods, one of the many, many gods that were in the system of the many, many gods of the pagan world, both first Greek and then Roman. And so we come tonight to begin our study at John chapter 19 and verse 9. Pilate entered his headquarters again, and he said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" And remember, this comes on the tail of being afraid of hearing that he was the Son of God, and he thought maybe his answer would get him some clarification about this. Where'd you come from? What kind of story would this guy have? Maybe if he could get his origin story, he could straighten out his thinking about this thing. But Jesus didn't answer, which equaled saying the charge is true, really. He didn't defend himself. You remember what Isaiah said about that back in Isaiah chapter 53? He said that he would be like a lamb before the shearers who did not open his mouth, like a sheep before the shearers, and like a lamb led to the slaughter. Jesus did not deny or contradict or defend himself against the charges they were making. And when they finally admitted to Pilate what they really wanted, not just that he was a troublemaker and he stirred up the people, but that he had called himself the Son of God, that was like blasphemy to those Jews. And Jesus wouldn't answer when Pilate asked him that. And then Pilate says to him in verse 10, "You will not speak to me?" That is, do you have any idea who you're not talking to? Don't you know? I've got authority to turn you loose. I've got authority to crucify you. In other words, he's telling Jesus, I'm holding your life in my hands. You'd better answer me when I talk to you. And if he had been from the South and was a little bit, intoxicated with the authority, he'd say, "Son," after he had told him that. But he had already heard that he might be a son of God, and so he didn't do that. But you see Pilate's prideful boast about, "I am in charge here. Don't you know who you're being quiet in front of when I told you to speak?" But Jesus was ready to properly classify any kind of power or authority that Pilate had. And so he tells him here in verse 11, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above." Now we'll get to the rest of Jesus' answer in just a minute, but let's stop and talk about that part so far. When Jesus said, "Unless you had been granted this power from above," I don't think he's talking about Caesar making him the governor. And all that was technically, in terms of Roman government, true. Pilate and every other Roman serving in the government served at the pleasure of the emperor. He could send them and he could recall them. And they often got recalled when something went wrong or they misbehaved in the emperor's eyes. They would get recalled and replaced. But I don't think that's what Jesus means. I think Jesus means about this authority being given to him, and by the way, given to Caesar himself, has come from above, not just higher up in the Roman government, but from God in heaven. Remember, Romans chapter 13 is the passage we turn to talk about how that civil government is ordained of God. Do you agree with everything the government does? No. Do you think that everybody in government is a godly person? No. Then how can this be so? If they are ordained or appointed or assigned by God to that position, if God grants them that power that they have over the citizens of a nation, how in the world is it possible that some evil, ungodly people like these Romans, and maybe some of you fill in the blank of some modern politicians that you know, how in the world is it that they can rise to such positions of power? Jesus says you wouldn't have it if it hadn't been given to you. And Romans 13 says that government has been ordained of God. I think that's the institution of civil government. But God used in the Old Testament, and I believe he still does in New Testament days, used all kind of people to accomplish his purpose. Look what he's going to do that day. He is going to use an unbelieving set of Jewish leaders. He's going to use an indifferent but very powerful Roman official to put his son to death because it was his purpose from before the world began. It was his intention. It was going to happen this way. Jesus said over and over again, said, "My hour has not yet come," but now the hour was there. And Pilate was there at that time and was going to do unwittingly exactly what God had determined he would do. He's about to step into history with an infamous asterisk after his name, the Roman governor who sentenced Jesus to death. And so Jesus is just reminding him that in the scheme of things, you have granted power. You don't have any power of your own. It came to you from above. And then notice what Jesus says. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. I don't think that's about Judas, although Judas was the one who betrayed him into the hands of the Jewish officials who then brought him to. I think that what Jesus is talking about here is that the Jewish leadership, particularly the high priest and his father-in-law, who had been the high priest before him, they were the ones who delivered him, having motivated an illegal assembly of the Sanhedrin in the middle of the night to convict Jesus, but they couldn't put him to death under Roman law. So they had to go over to Pilate and get him up before daylight to judge this case and let them get Jesus on the cross, and then they could forget about Jesus, they thought. And so he says, the one who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. How was the sin of the Jewish leaders in delivering Jesus up to Pilate? How was that sin greater than what Pilate was going to do when he signs his death warrant? How was it greater?
They should have known from the prophets.
Yes. They did it with a degree of guilt intensified by what they should have known and what they had opportunity and had seen with their eyes and heard with their ears, and their heart was hardened, just like the prophet said that it would be, so that they did not believe it. They would not believe it. In John 9, they denied their own intelligence rather than believe what the obvious truth about Jesus really was, because he wasn't the kind of Messiah they were looking for. He's not our Messiah, even when they saw all the signs that he was. They should have known. They were more guilty. That's like Judah and Israel in the Old Testament were more guilty than their pagan neighbors for worshiping the same false gods, because they should have known better. The other distinction, I think, that makes Pilate's guilt different from the guilt of the Jewish leadership, which was even greater, was that this was not just civil government. This was spiritual leadership of the nation, what was left of it in that time. This remnant of Jews that had survived out of the captivities and survived through the several centuries since then, they had spiritual authority, and they were horribly in abuse. You remember how Jesus described them? That the poor old people were like sheep having no shepherd, because their shepherds were delinquent. They had turned purely political, not spiritual at all. And you'll watch these guys play political hardball as well as any senator or congressman of this day. They really do, or president. They can play hardball politics with Caesar himself, and they're going to. But Jesus is making it clear, Governor Pilate, you're not in charge like you think you are. You're like a chess piece on God's giant board, and he's put you in this place at this time to do what you're about to do. But the one who delivered me over to you is even more guilty than you are. That motivated Pilate to try even harder to get Jesus released. He's bloodied him already. Remember, many criminals or people in Roman custody died under the examination scourge, which is really a flogging with a whip with multiple tails and sharp rocks and bone in the end of those tails, and it drew the blood. But not only that, it flayed the skin. And a lot of people died under that kind of beating. But now Pilate's trying to release him. He's still looking for a way to let Jesus go. To show compassion to Jesus, I doubt it. But to show these Jews they could not push him around. He would not be motivated or manipulated by a bunch of Jews. But the Jews pull out their best pitch and they throw it. If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. This is the adult equivalent of kids bullying one another. We'll tell on you if you don't do what we say. Never mind what we're doing. If you don't do what we say, we will tell on you. And we'll tell the emperor, and we'll tell him that you're letting people go that claim to be the king, and he won't like that, will he? And what happens after they make that kind of threat? They added this to it. They said, everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. That's absolutely right. No rebellion, no riot, no interruption of the revenue. That's what Rome wanted. And somebody walking around talking about being another king was a death sentence on that person for doing so. And so they're manipulating the Roman understanding of what the king talk meant, what the kingdom talk meant, to push him to go ahead and do what they wanted done with the threat, the emperor will hear about this. Now, Pilate is going to say, this trial is over. I'm not going to listen to any more testimony. I'm not going to have any more arguments. When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Aramaic, Gabbatha. The Roman stonemasons had a way of making an impressive, it could be the wall in a house or a feature, like in a garden somewhere, or in the case of the governor's judgment pavements, they had these smooth stones that they laid out just so, and they could do it in a way so that this throne would rise up in the rock, out of the stone formation, and it was a rather impressive place to come and pass judgment on someone. It was like when in a courtroom, when the judge's bench is way up high, it was getting the authority figure up high to talk down to the people when he pronounced judgment on them. And that's where the sentencing of Jesus was going to take place. Now, it's the day of preparation. What does that mean? That's the day when the Passover lamb who's been put up and kept is going to be killed. Later in the same day, in the afternoon, when Jesus is dying on the cross, as the sun is going down in the west, when those lambs are being slaughtered, the Son of God would deliver himself his spirit into the hands of God. He would say, it is finished. And the real Passover lamb, Jesus the Christ, would die for the sins of the people, just like Caiaphas had unwittingly predicted that he would after the resurrection of Lazarus. And so it's preparation day. Remember, that's why these Jews wouldn't go in Pilate's house. We're not going to defile it. We'll lie and we'll be, parties to murder, but we will not go in a Gentile's house because we're not going to make ourselves ceremonially unclean, unable to eat the Passover, the biggest night of the year for us, and we're not going to miss the dinner. It was about the 6th hour. This is preparation day. That tells you that what Jesus ate with the disciples the night before was not actually the Passover meal. That was to come the next night. But they ate this meal of preparation, and it was the one the night before the Passover. It's about the 6th hour. Is this Roman time or Jewish time? If it's Roman time, it's 6 o'clock in the morning. This stuff's been going on all night long. And since this is a Roman trial process, that may well be right, because this 6th hour does not go along with Luke saying it was about the 6th hour after Jesus has been on the cross for some time when it's going to get dark and stay dark. I think, and some of you may correct me about this, and that'll be fine. I'd be glad to understand it better. I think that the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, taught more in terms of measuring by Hebrew time, where for some reason here in John, in Pilate's courtroom, time is marked by what Roman time would be, like yours and mine. We would think of 6 a.m. Jesus is on the cross by 9. He's got a long, difficult walk ahead of him before he gets out of the city with that cross. And he's going to be on the cross till 3. In those last 3 hours, it's going to be dark. From the 9th hour from the 6th hour to the 9th hour, as Luke describes it. Is that right? Yes, on Jewish time. So I believe this is early, early morning when they're at Pilate's judgment seat. And he marches them out. Everybody's been up. He hasn't been up all night. The rest of them have been. And he says to the Jews, "Behold your king." It's the second time he's marched them out. First time he said, "Behold the man." And this time he says, "Behold your king." And they did not let up a beat. They cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" They hated Jesus. They wanted him dead, and nothing but crucifixion was going to work. Now, when Pilate had said, "Behold your king," he was going to get a lot of mileage out of that. One, he was goading the Jews. He's your king. This is your king. This man looks like a threat to Rome. This is your king. And then at the same time, it is reminding them of whose thumb is on all of them. This is what we do to kings who try to rise up against Caesar. So he got a lot of knowledge out of king. He's not even through using that language yet. We'll see it again in just a couple of minutes. But he tells the Jewish leadership they're spitting mad. They're so worked up. And when he says, "Behold your king," they cry out, "Away with him, crucify him." And Pilate says to them, "Oh, you want me to crucify your king?" And then they said it. Then they said the thing that denied their relationship with God. Then they said the thing that professed, hypocritically, but professed allegiance to Caesar that day because it suited their purposes for Caesar to be emperor and for Pilate to do what they wanted done that day. And they said, "We have no king but Caesar." They had already rejected God by rejecting his son. But here, on the record, and again, I don't think Pilate knew how this would be worked out in Scripture, and certainly these Jews didn't. But here it is on the record, the formal, complete denunciation of Jesus. And they're willing to take a Caesar who is going to abuse them and treat them horribly and put tens of thousands of them on crosses in Jerusalem. They would rather say that man's our king than God their Father, who had been nothing but good to them throughout their history. They had spit in his face for centuries. God had been good to them. He had kept his promises to Abraham and had preserved the seed so that Jesus would be born and he would be Christ. But they're willing to say no to all that God has ever been or done for them because in their rage of that moment, they wanted Jesus dead, and this was the path. So Pilate said, "Okay, I'll crucify your king." And he delivered him over to them to be crucified. Them, although the Romans carried it out, Roman soldiers nailed him to the cross. Pilate sent out a detachment of soldiers with a soldier over them to oversee the crucifixion, Jesus and two other people. But I think he delivered him over to them, that is, "Okay, you guys can have him," to the high priest, to the Jewish leaders that wanted him dead. And so they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of a skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. And that's all John says about what we call the Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross. The synoptics have a longer description of what happened along the way when Jesus was carrying his own cross and fell under the weight of it, and Simon of Cyrene was brought in to carry the cross. And Jesus had an exchange with the women who were weeping, and other details. John, in one sentence, describes all of that and does not share those details that the synoptics do. But they come out to this place. It's called the place of the skull. Some of you have been to the Holy Land and may know that the traditional site of the crucifixion cannot be verified historically, but the traditional place of the crucifixion is a place where the geologic formation of the cliff, the big bluff, overlooking the city and outside the city walls, of course, but up where Jesus was crucified when he went out of the sea, does bear a striking resemblance to a skull shape. You've probably seen pictures of it if you've not been there in person. I've only seen the pictures, but I see what they're talking about. That may be what the place of a skull means there. We're not sure, really. In Aramaic, it's Golgotha. It may have been a place where death was so strongly, it probably sensed and smelled that it reminded them of death in the place of the skull. But it may be that bluff there with the rock formation that does look a lot like a human skull. And there they crucified him. 2 others with him. That's all John's going to say about them. Now the other got the exchange between Jesus and them and the thieves talking to one another, and one of them coming to faith in Christ as he's hanging there on the cross with Jesus. He comes to believe in the kingdom that's coming, even when Jesus does not look anything like a king, stripped naked and hung on a cross. And these 2 thieves, like the prophet prophesied, are going to be killed with him that day. And Jesus is there between them. That is really at a pretty good breaking point for tonight. But let's talk about this last thing. Next time, we're going to talk about what Pilate wrote and why he wrote it and why the Jews hated it. You remember that? What Pilate wrote on the charge that's above Jesus nailed up to his cross. What he wrote, why he wrote it, and why the Jews hated it so badly. I want you to look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and get a composite of what that piece of paper said. The 4 do not agree word for word in what was there. Look at what they had in common. Look at the additional details each supplies, and come back with what you perceive that piece of paper really said that was Jesus' death warrant. Okay? But for tonight, that's all the time we have. I want to thank you for being with us. I'm so glad you came to Bible study. This is solemn business, these passages as we go through John. But I thank you for being interested and being here to study it with us. May your tribe increase, and you'll have a pleasant evening. Thank you for watching. We'll be back Sunday morning at 10:30 with our morning worship on YouTube. 9:30 for you all at Bible study here. Thank you. Good night.